Welcome to part 7 of the Unobstructed Way. We'll be looking at how we spiritually absorb life experiences, unobstructed business practices, ghostly experiments conducted by Stewart and Betty and their friends, and much more. Quote, "The world is run as it is to demonstrate individual responsibility," unquote. That's from the Betty book. One sentence at a time. Often the invisibles used symbols to teach Betty. Her skeleton pulled from her body was meant to show her that she could and should give up the limiting beliefs about herself and the world she had haphazardly acquired. In the unobstructed, Betty could choose to renew her body, put on new clothes and different jewelry, and enjoy the surroundings of her choice. But the process wasn't easy. At first, Betty felt cold, her naked consciousness exposed, until she learned to attract substance and how to concentrate it with her thoughts. The Betty book was culled from the first 400 pages of notes Betty channeled, but 15 years had passed and another 1,500 pages had accumulated. Everyone agreed that the best approach was to release the material chronologically in the hope that the process, which had worked for Betty, would work for readers. In trance, Betty spoke with a voice different from her own, most often in the Scottish brogue of an invisible named Gaelic. But the invisibles were involved as a committee. This was a community effort. When Gaelic spoke, Betty was not asleep or unconscious. She often participated, directly reporting the challenges and epiphanies she was having. She shared the symbolic visions she was given to help explain difficult concepts. And her comments shed light and brought genuine emotions and a merry wit to the conversations. The Invisibles admitted that this process was trial and error on their side. They tried different approaches. Some experiments failed, and they asked for patience from Stewart and Betty while they refined their techniques. Stewart asked about examples of what seemed to be easier mediumship with more spectacular results, like Margaret Cameron's The Seven Purposes and Darby and Jones' Our Unseen Guest. Stewart probably knew about Edgar Cayce by the time the Betty book was written. The Invisibles responded by saying such experiments were usually too one-sided, requiring an extraordinary effort from the unobstructed, an imbalance that often produced spectacular failures. The Betty experiment was to be a new, more balanced approach. At times, the Invisibles complained about how difficult it is to work within the corridors of the human brain. Still, the goal for all human beings is to have our spiritual faculties using the brain as it was intended to be used. Whereas today, for most of us, the brain alone runs the show, creating predicaments. On over a dozen subjects, the Invisibles delivered what amounted to, as Stewart writes, quote, "a complete short essay properly formed and proportioned," unquote. But these essays arrived only a few sentences, usually one sentence at a time, over years. According to Stewart, the Make It So chapter of the Betty book was made from 25 entries, ranging from page 1 of the channeled material to page 390. A year and a half had passed between the first and the last. Stewart kept index cards divided by subject. He was amazed when he finally put the sentences together in the order received and found they required no editing. Spiritual absorption. In the unobstructed, when an invisible wants to attempt a creative project, helpers are found by proposing altruistic goals. In the afterlife, we can't pay people or charm them or provide the perks that keep corporate politics and business going. But we can dream up an idea that will help people in the obstructed, that will get us all the help we need. For those in the obstructed, the work still must be done. If we delay, the challenge is made more painful by inertia and regret. We are told to, quote, do it now, unquote. By awakening our spiritual faculties, our lives will be better and our enjoyment of life greater. To put it off is to stagnate and collect more suffering. Betty commented, quote, the people who try to escape and have bad luck, opium, drink, why, even anarchy. It sounds dreadful to say that. They haven't stability, but they are trying. We grieve most over the poor in spirit who close their hearts, unquote. Quote, you are engaged at present in spiritual absorption of yourself, unquote, the invisibles explained. Quote, there still remains in you a stronghold of earth inertia, which must be overcome before we can proceed freely and satisfactorily. The barrier is in the nature of a wall built of years of depositing weighty things that should have been disembodied by spiritual application. Everybody builds this wall. It must be disembodied before we can proceed, or you will be continually returning to it. It is a kind of a world dump of unassimilated experiences, merely recognized mentally, but not lived up to, unquote. Quote, if you once get that idea, unquote, Betty added, quote, you can start absorbing things. It makes the whole solid world soluble in spirit. To you, it looks as though nothing could destroy Mount Diablo. But from here, it seems as though sufficient spiritual power could actually dissolve it. And far beyond, I can dimly sense the power to put together again, unquote. Quote, we ingest experience as the sustaining nutriment of life, unquote, the invisibles explained. Quote, that nutriment is assimilated as the body assimilates food. By means of it, we are empowered to fill out one level of consciousness so that we may rise to the next, unquote. Eating food, we are able to transform ourselves from infants to adults in the obstructed universe. Eating experiences, we are able to transform from creatures of little consciousness to great vessels of expanded awareness. Every experience is food for the soul, but none more so than a life well lived. Glimpses of the unobstructed. Betty explained that in the unobstructed, she has a body, but of a much finer and more responsive substance. She pointed out that thoughts are what really move our legs when we walk, releasing electrical chemical messages that carry our intentions. In the unobstructed, she reported, quote, I go because I want to go. Waves of pressure instead of steps, unquote. Later, she learns to combine this with another activity, like a pulse of being. She compares to breathing. Together, this movement without flesh and bone legs and this breathing without lungs draws nourishment. Stewart asked the invisibles if they see us in our world as we do. Most do not, since they do not have physical eyes. They see us from the inside. and can get only a fuzzy picture of how our outsides look, a process that they say is dependent on or comparable to memory. Some in the unobstructed specialize in understanding the laws of interactions between the two worlds, and they can do surprising things, including seeing the physical world clearly. Repeatedly, the invisibles warn that the obstructed mind, even such a well-trained one as Betty's, cannot fully comprehend the unobstructed. Only a glimpse of the border is possible. Betty warns us about the limitations of human language. She compares the experience of the unobstructed to glorious music that sweeps you up, to air so full of energy, it's as different from the air we breathe as boiling water is from stagnant water. All her metaphors, we're reminded, are meant to inspire. They cannot give an accurate description because the unobstructed is too different from anything we know. Just as the physical body has senses, so does the spiritual, but describing them in terms we could understand is almost impossible. We are told of one sense called perception. Perception is the spiritual sense the invisibles want us to develop. The inspiration of artists is given as an example. Artists can study, daydream, and otherwise hunt inspiration, but it usually comes unexpectedly and often at awkward moments. It arrives with undeniable clarity. This spiritual sense of perception will be developed by all human beings eventually. Quote, reason is not the end of the line for human evolution, unquote. Consider the use of your body, the invisible said. Quote, it tells you when you are hungry and when you are thirsty and when you are hot or cold, and also what to do to remedy it. Your physical senses take you through physical life pretty well. In the same way, your spiritual sense, once developed, has a hunger for service, a thirst for harmony, a perception of the heat and cold of human hearts, unquote. The test of selection. The invisibles describe our world as a test of selection. The diversity of things in the obstructed are compared to toys that teach children coordination and to the resistance of the air that supports an airplane as it flies. The obstructed is a world where we come into contact with things because we, quote, cannot overcome nothing, unquote. Resistances we must overcome help us earn greater quantity and ultimately quality of consciousness. Stewart sums it up, quote, in the course of our evolution, we progress through a series of levels. No grade can be skipped, and each level must be filled out before it is left. We fill out our levels by the assimilation of experience, and in this process, our greatest ally is the force which we gain from spiritual contact, unquote. According to Stewart, we are not only responsible to ourselves for this assimilation, but to all beings that share our world, a world marred by the neglect of previous generations who lost touch with the mission of life and wallowed in materiality. Quote, if we shirk what is placed before us, unquote, he wrote, quote, then we turn loose a derelict that may wreck or destroy. If we would avoid damage or destruction ourselves, we must develop to the point of acquiring protection. And our responsibility is more than our share because the past has bequeathed its heritage of fault and failure, unquote. In other words, if we do not live our lives to the fullest, if we only succeed partially, then we leave more work and more pitfalls for the next soul that comes along. Through the evolutionary accomplishment that is a well-lived life, we not only ascend to new levels of potential, we also make life easier for others in the obstructed. Betty herself had to master a subtle form of the test of selection. Stewart wrote that distortions had muddied their work until she had learned by patience and practice to distinguish between true and false communications. Betty reported, quote, "The false messages had always been delivered with feverish haste and great force, in contrast to the calm and deliberation of other communications, especially those from my father," unquote. With that realization, she could edit as she went, cutting the urgent messages before they reached expression. But who was behind these false communications? Betty called them, quote, "interruptions from opposing forces," unquote. There is no further explanation of who or what these opposing forces might be. Unobstructed business. We must be bountiful, the invisibles taught, because otherwise we stagnate and we fail to hold up our part of the collective bargain that could make this a better world. This is the law of circulation, and it operates on every level. The invisibles provided a phrase that would be a worthy motto for 21st century businesses: a hunger for service, a thirst for harmony. But the invisibles also cautioned that, quote, "a man who has no spiritual alliance, no source of vitality, renewal, whose existence is concentration on business details, gets business adhesions. He either overreaches himself by establishing a haggling standard of business, or he bankrupts his own soul," unquote. The invisibles describe an alternative, quote, "the other man keeps himself replenished and his vision raised above his work. He creates a different order of business. I grant you, he's not always as successful by the same standards, but he doesn't want to be. He's of a higher type of development. His business has a life-giving quality instead of a blood-sucking quality," unquote. How is the higher development of business conducted? The invisibles explained, quote, "there is an open-hearted feeling hard to describe. It is not just making yourself charitably disposed toward people. That's an imitation. Awkward, paltry, blundering. You don't try to please people. That's silly. You just proceed on your way. But the emanations from an open heart spread around you, working according to their law and bringing return of rich reaction. In your relations to people, it isn't at all this everything to everybody hand grasp idea. That's the cheap imitation, very cheap. There is dignity and reserve and depth to the real thing. It is just a quiet feeling, a silent feeling of kinship and sympathetic response instead of the usual indifference we feel," unquote. In response, Stewart addressed the cynics among us, quote, "most people have an instinctive aversion to carrying sweetness and light to darkened souls. Those who try it on anyhow generally do little but get in wrong with their friends," unquote. But he points out there is another kind of service. When spiritual contact has made you sure-footed, others are attracted. Quote, "when you want to germinate people," unquote, the invisibles explained, quote, "you admit them to a companionship in your spiritual contact. It is like taking them in out of the cold," unquote. Betty reiterated, quote, "no use pointing out people's faults and attacking them. That is silly. If you arouse their inner selves, they will take care of their own faults, unquote. We must be careful to stay humble. Quote, whatever you do, unquote, advise the invisibles, quote, avoid the holier than thou attitude toward people. That is far from what we want. The worst ones often are the narrow and virtuous ones. They blind the trail. Nobody wants to be like them, so they go off in the wrong direction. They are very harmful people, very harmful, unquote. Stewart's theory of communication. Appendix 1 of the Betty book presents Stewart's theory as to how the invisibles were able to use Betty's unconscious to communicate their messages. He immediately admitted that each of us will have to decide for ourselves what makes the most sense. Then he offered possible explanations. Perhaps Betty was uniquely suited for the task. She may have accessed, quote, the universal mind, unquote, a reservoir of wisdom. She may have gotten in touch with, quote, race consciousness, unquote, what Jung called the collective unconscious, the accumulated archive of human experiences. Stewart concluded, quote, or finally, the source may be what it purports to be, distinct, discarnate intelligences, unquote. Stewart also admits common sense has a hard time with all of this. If you find yourself in a conversation with a discarnate, quote, Julius Caesar or Napoleon or William James, he's a favorite, then your innate modesty is quite likely to join hands with your skepticism, unquote. Stewart is himself skeptical of the spiritualist tradition of long conversations with Plato, Nero, and Judas, quote, all of whom seem to be dwelling in bliss as a happy family, and all of whom seem frantically eager to rush into conference at any hour of the day or night with any Tom, Dick, or Harry who calls them up. William James must be either ubiquitous or must possess a large corps of secretaries to get around it all, unquote. Why then did so many mediums find themselves talking to great historical personalities? Was it merely inflated ego or outright fraud? Stewart suggested a different explanation. Quote, all a matter of the translation of the impression on the subconscious. Some little thing reminds the station's mind of Caesar or Plato or Nero or James. It seizes and personifies that idea and is off on a tangent of its own, unquote. Stewart explained the complexity of translating the idea or image impressed by the invisibles in Betty's subconscious to accurate spoken language. Quote, to go back to our simple illustration, let us suppose that in life a son called his father daddy, and that for purposes of identification, he desires that this precise diminutive be got over. But the station used to call his own father dad. That would first present itself as a suitable translation of the impression. It would be inhibited by the invisible, as would in turn papa, father, governor, old man, etc. Then would ensue what the records call, quote, difficulty, unquote. If the station's conscious attention were roused, failure would result. Yet to the son seeking communication with his father, it would seem an absurdly easy test. How much more difficult to get over a pet name, entirely personal to those who used it, or for that matter, names or dates at all, unquote. The invisibles explain that Ouija planchette movements or table tipping are easy places to start because they involve only a few choices. Automatic writing, a bit more complex, is at least limited to only 26 choices, the letters of the alphabet that make up English words. But to experiment in direct mediumship involves innumerable choices and the further complications of the mental and emotional history and habits of the medium, unquote. Ghostly experiments. Appendix 2 documents 10 meetings over 6 weeks in 1922 when experiments in ectoplasmic and other manifestations were conducted by the Whites. It begins with a gathering of friends. Stewart wrote, quote, "Now, here were 8 people, all of whom by temperament and training were practical, hard-headed, and known to each other as of unquestioned integrity," unquote. They had no experience with professional mediums or seances. 3 of them were mediums, including Betty. The experiments were conducted with a sense of fun. They were not awestruck by results, nor did they consider any aspect of the proceedings sacred. Stewart reports on his merry band of explorers' experiments with spiritual manifestations in tedious detail to prove the thoroughness of the participants on this side and the other. Spirits are named, like the aforementioned Lady Anne, whose thick Scottish accent Stewart attempts to reproduce. The experiments included color light bulbs. The 25-watt lilac bulb was chosen as most effective. A screen was draped in black cloth and set up, surrounding Joan on 3 sides. Smoke like ectoplasm emerged from her fingers. Cold areas were predicted and found. Parts of Joan's body glowed with something more interior than simple phosphorescence. Mist formed into a hand and forearm right before their eyes. The invisibles were intent on demonstrating what they called the beta body, the unique eternal form of each consciousness, as opposed to the, quote, disintegrating shells, unquote, of physical bodies. Joan's beta was moved slightly away from her body. The explorers, guided by the invisibles, found the right cold spot in the air and were told to pinch. These pinches caused automatic reactions in the corresponding parts of Joan's blindfolded physical body. Air pinches a foot away from her caused reflex reactions in her leg, arm, and head. Then the invisibles tried to make Joan's beta body visible. The eyewitnesses got glimpses of something that Stewart probably would have used the word hologram to describe had holograms existed. The explorers saw demonstrations of the manifestations made possible when the obstructed and unobstructed collaborate. Manifestations of light, quote, palpitating mists, unquote, superimposed faces like supernatural masks, the blurring and disappearance of solid objects so that the background could be seen through them. And there were, it seems, eerie presentiments that could be recognized in the Betty book only after the fact of her death. As we have seen, she was shown an image of her skeleton removed from her body. And among other comments by Betty that Stewart reported is this one about their experiments with Joan. Quote, "She said that it seemed to her intended more as a development work for the 2 of them than an attempt to do anything for us. And at one time remarked, quote, 'They have freed us both together for future work,' unquote. In the not too distant future, Joan would be channeling Betty." That brings us to the end of part 7. Part 8, Across the Unknown, Sex After Death and the Secret of Success, includes new definitions of the words spiritual and imagination, the differences and similarities between occultists, psychics, and followers of traditional religions, what you can take with you, and how the dead communicate with the living, and more. Tamra and I hope that you enjoyed this and that you find it inspiring. Please consider subscribing or giving us a thumbs up or leaving a comment so that we know that you would like to have more of these.